once labeled, a person may be haunted by that label for life, and it can lead to many harmful unintended consequences.
That brings me perfectly to probably my favorite quote of yours that I've seen you say many times is, psychiatric diagnoses should always be written in pencil, especially for teenagers and children.
And once the diagnosis is made, it lives forever. It doesn't disappear. It's not written in pencil. It's written in computer code that will last throughout the patient's life. If you just wait, watchful waiting, many of the symptoms are going to improve within a month. People get much better within a month just waiting. And many people stay on medication for decades, lifetime, who don't need it. First off, I wanted to remove gender identity disorder completely from DSM-IV.
You did?
Yeah. And so it was equivalent to homosexuality. Why should it be in the manual? There have been so few malpractice cases. There have been so few people saying, I made the change and it was an absolute disaster. I am very confused about this area, and I think I'm confused not because I'm dumb about it or because I haven't looked at it. I think I'm confused because it's confusing. It's not a DSM issue.
Where are we going to put this if it's not psychiatric?
Medical.
Welcome, everyone. This is an unusual beginning to a podcast because, as you can see, our guest is not present with us, and there's a reason for that. So we interviewed somebody that I have long admired, Dr. Alan Francis, who is a very distinguished psychiatrist. He was part of the DSM-III. He was the chair of the DSM-IV Task Force, and then he has been very vocally critical of DSM-V and the direction psychiatry has gone in since, which is obviously something that interests me. So it was my idea to invite him on the podcast, and I was very, very excited to interview him. I was. And then the interview did not go how I was hoping. I prepared for days. I had pages of notes. I had so many questions ready to ask him and barely got to ask him any because, well, Stella, would you like to say what happened?
Yeah. So it's Professor Alan Francis, and he is very eminent, and he's very educated, erudite, decent, honourable, thoughtful man. And evidently very, very well informed in all aspects around diagnosis. So the first half of the interview was, I think, phenomenal. I think it was really, really interesting, and I'm really, really glad. And there was, quite a few things he said about the DSM, like, it's a franchising publication and things like that. That I was like, wow. He was very, very interesting on it. However, we definitely didn't agree over gender dysphoria. And we thought we would. And I'm a bit embarrassed because I didn't really know anything about Alan Francis. You were very, very much leading the way. And I was as excited, because you're infectious, Mia. I was as excited as you were. And you brought it in. It's so nice, like in the interview. And, Alan is lovely. He handles it lovely because we don't agree. And I think it's a very good model of civilized disagreement. And wouldn't it be great if there was replicas of that all over the world, where people like us are interviewing people like Alan, we don't agree and we have thoughtful disagreement and we say, thank you very much, goodbye, because that's what this is.
Yeah.
So the only regret I have, and I do have a regret, is I presumed he would agree. And had I known he wouldn't agree, I would have been more prepared. As you can see in the middle, the two of us, like, we are astonished, and the interview takes a complete swerve in the middle.
I will say, okay, first of all, I should say I take full responsibility for what happened, because while I spent days
what happened? It was very good. It was very interesting,
good.
And it was good for the brain. It's not a bad thing as such.
Right. More that we weren't ready. I've read his book, but I read his book a long time ago, and I loved his book, Saving Normal. It's a great book. And then when I spent days preparing, I was reading all of his gorgeous articles, listening to his interviews, and just focusing on his work on speaking out against the DSM. I somehow missed the fact that we were going to disagree. Now, I will say the way we structured the interview, I wanted to talk about autism. He's spoken about the epidemics of autism, ADHD, and bipolar that came from his DSM-IV. They were trying to be really conservative, and they still triggered 3 epidemics, psychiatric epidemics of overdiagnosis. And so I wanted to talk about that first, because there was something in me that thought, this man should be front and center in the gender debate. He should be speaking out as strongly against the epidemic, the overdiagnosis of gender dysphoria, and the epidemic of adolescents identifying as trans and having body parts chopped off. He should be right there front and center. And it made me suspicious that he's not, right? So I actually wanted to talk about ADHD and autism first, not because I thought what happened would happen. I didn't think it was going to go in that direction, but just because something was off with me that he is not with us. And I just kind of figured he wants a quiet life, and he's retired and he wants a quiet life.
But there was a flaw. We didn't know he was on Twitter.
No. That was a novice mistake on my part, and
I'm
now
not a novice. Check his Twitter handle.
Right, learned that lesson. That's a lesson learned. But still, at the time, it was very stressful for me because I just wasn't ready for the direction the conversation went in. I have since watched the interview twice in preparation for this pre-interview that we're doing, and I have something of a different opinion of it now that when I've watched it calmer. It was very stressful for me at the time, and I don't think I'm not happy with how I handled it. I wish I had done things differently, but I will say that he was very clear that we only had 45 minutes when we set up the interview, and we'd already spent 25 minutes or so talking about all the other stuff. So we really needed hours to go into the disagreement that we had, and we had 20 minutes.
That's a very good point, actually. What I love about this, and why I'm really glad we're putting it out, is that it's in real time what is happening to everybody who would have our perspective in this debate. That in real time, you presume somebody is going to be well informed and they're going to understand the concept is arguably flawed in premise. You know, this idea that you can be born in the wrong body, or that there's an inbuilt somehow gendered soul within you that likes stereotypes, toys, that couldn't even be conceived of when you're a fetus, because a fetus doesn't know what toys are or what pink is or what blue is, but there's some sort of inbuilt thing in them. The whole thing is so incoherent in a way. And then when you meet somebody really intelligent that you really regard, and they completely disagree, and they say it's an inbuilt, frankly, a biological, this is how Alan Francis, I believe, kind of understands it. This is an inbuilt issue that it does not need, it does not, he blew our brains out because he said, no, it shouldn't be in the DSM. And you look all excited because it shouldn't be.
That
it's
was
just
the
a
moment,
medical problem. Yeah, there's a crucial moment there when he says it shouldn't be in the DSM, and you get all excited, and so do I silently. And he goes a very different way with it. But what happens is then you and I start to kind of try to rally and try to put different questions to him. For example, we talk about, he says there hasn't been malpractice, and I say, there has been quite a few malpractice. Again, we didn't have time to go into detail, but the rise in the number of detransitions, I'm not sure he's aware of them. And also then the childhood onset, again and again and again, I think in this world, we have people who presume that childhood onset is somehow the real thing. And as somebody who's suffered from it myself, I think it's really flawed. I think a lot of people on our side argue, you know what I mean, that childhood onset is it's the real trans or something
True
like
trans.
that. And yeah, they seem to think it. And so, you know what I mean, that's where I kind of part ways with organizations like SEGM and stuff, where they think if we keep on doing research, we'll somehow prove the point. And I'm like, I don't believe so. I don't think so, because people believe in this true trans concept, and we have to approach that. That's a conceptual, because they don't care about the research, because they just think this is research on people who are gay and people who regret being gay. People who have that conceptual understanding, and that is the majority of people in the world. That conceptual
including
understanding.
Alan Francis, you see, and that's just that was it, wasn't it? That was where, because we disagreed on that, he actually believes in true trans, and therefore from that point on we could never agree on anything. But there's a really interesting part when he says I'm confused not because I'm dumb, but because it's confusing. And that's it. That really is truly it. He's certainly not dumb. He certainly is confused, and it certainly is confusing. So he nailed it right there. That's what went wrong, is that he sees us as extremists.
Yeah.
He sees two sides, and it's very political. On one side, it's the right wing, they're the bigots, they're the hateful ones, and on the other side, they're the extremists. Oh no, I guess we're on the right wing side. He did kind of say that, right?
He did actually say that right wing thing, and I was saddened by that, because this idea that there's extremists on both sides and they're wrecking the debate. Well, I don't think we're extremists.
He does, though, but that's because he's confused and he doesn't understand. Like, I genuinely think that he has no understanding of the incredible fraud of WPATH. I bet, I would be willing to bet that he has no idea how fraudulent WPATH is. I would be willing to bet that he has absolutely no understanding of the appalling science behind puberty suppression. I would think that he's confused because he's actually got no understanding of the scale of the medical side of this scandal, and therefore, and also the role that trans activism has played all along in shaping this diagnosis. I mean, he should know that.
I'm not sure if I agree with you, because I think he'd say, yeah, that might be true. There might be fraud from the WPATH. I don't know. Wouldn't it be amazing if Alan Francis will come on again? I think we're going to try very hard to convince him to come on again so that we can discuss issues like this. But I don't think that would bother him. He would say, okay, there's fraud. Okay, there's trans activism. Okay, there's this, that, and the other. There is still some people with an inbuilt thing within them, and they need to medicalize, and he thinks they're going to have lives of utter distress, and I think it's because he's never had gender distress, and it's so strange. There's something about castration anxiety with men in particular, that they just think it's so inconceivable that a man would want to remove his penis. This is beyond my understanding, and therefore they must have something wrong with them inside.
That was Harry Benjamin's diagnostic test. Have you read that? Harry Benjamin's diagnostic test for who is true trans was, if a man wants his penis inverted, then he's true trans, because no man would actually want that. That was his test. It was like, just if you want the surgery, that means you're trans, so you should be able to have it.
You laugh. I think most men would agree. Like, it's their dearest possession. It's like, this could not be a man. Most men would be nodding vigorously at this. I honestly do. I think this is a key reason why men stay out of the debate, why men don't want to discuss it, why men just think, whatever they want, let them have it. Yeah. They're talking about something so insane that I cannot get my head around it. That's my theory.
Now, I'll say one regret that I have. I didn't even manage to get to autogynephilia. So we did talk about the childhood onset, and I did put to him that most of these childhood onset kids are gay. They grow up to be, they're future homosexuals. They grow up to be gay, and he agreed with me. So he's got some level of understanding there.
Oh, definitely.
That this is not it's not like, well, okay, no, he still believes in true trans. So he does believe that most of the kids with this severe, persistent gender distress will grow up to be homosexual. But he still believes that some of them are true trans and therefore will need puberty suppression. And he said lovely things about, I think he was saying it prior to the gender discussion part of it, where he was saying, there's a continuum of symptoms, but he did say it beautifully with gender. He says there's a continuum of symptoms, but the medical treatment requires a straight yes, no in the moment. You can't wait, you've got to put him on puberty blockers. Otherwise he used an example. It's difficult to be like a 6'4" hulking man if you're a woman or something. You called him out on that as well, but it's true trends. It always comes down to true trends. Like, instead of seeing all of these little boys as just being little boys who like Barbie dolls and dresses and whatever, he's seeing that some of them truly are trends, and that's the activist slant. But I wonder how much of an understanding he has of autogynephilia, because I think most of the men who are saying that who are 6'4" and they're saying that they were these effeminate girls, I think they're probably not. They're probably autogynephilic men who were not in any way childhood onset kids. They rewrite their own pasts to fit with the present version of themselves as a woman, right? And I wonder if he's got any understanding of the autogynephilic side of it, and how they will very much say that they knew they were girls from the earliest age, but that's not true.
Yeah, I think he would still nod along and say, and yet there's a small percentage. You know what I mean? And that I think is the issue you and I and every one of us have been confronting all along. And then there's the kind of the misinformation. And I agree with you, obviously I agree with you about the fraud of WPATH and the awful research that does not support this. It's all shoddy research. What was it, like 2%? Hilary Cass brought out 2% was actually high quality research, and the rest was just shoddy. Like, it's absolutely awful. And it's great. When Jesmic were in Capitol Hill recently, we spoke to HHS, and there's going to be effectively an American CAS coming out at the end of April.
Wow.
And so that's going to sort out the research. We've got CAS on this side. We've got the American version very soon coming out. And so it's arguably going to give us a very strong evidence base in on both sides of the pond. But the problem is that when we quote stats, like you quoted the 5,000, and then you went back and you had your exact numbers, and he said, yeah, I don't buy that. And I thought, we're living in this post-fact age where somebody can say, yeah, I don't think those facts are right. And it's like, and you were like, oh no, they're right. And you had all the details. And it was just like, but no. And it's very hard to work with this. And it's a real replica of all the conversations that you have with your mother and your uncle and all that, where you're like, but you've got your facts wrong. It's very hard.
I mean, that part, honestly, I'm still upset about that part, because, okay, I wasn't like, he's talking about polling, and I get it, polling, you can't get a percentage
Completely
of the population from random polling, but I wasn't talking about polling. I was talking about the actual surge in adolescent girls at the Tavistock referrals.
I know.
It's hard data. It's not, and I had the exact, 5,300. I've written about it. I've spoken about it so many times that it's imprinted in my mind. It's right there. And so the thing about that was I think that's the, Govinda, when we interviewed Govinda Bogle, and he has the ideology, people can use their intelligence in the service of an ideology. They can warp things, and they can take information and distort it so that it fits with their ideological beliefs. And the interesting thing about that part is, yes, like his response when I said it's 5,337% increase, he said he instantly came back with something like, well, if you've got a very low base rate to begin with, then that's very easy. And I think that's the part where I tried to say, but that's the point. There were no adolescent girls. That's the whole point. When a patient population springs out of nowhere, explodes into existence, and that patient population is adolescent girls, you've got an epidemic. You've got a social contagion on your hands. And the I think he agreed with that, and yet still true trans.
Oh, he did.
So
In fairness, he did, and that's, you and I kind of collapse over the true trans things, but I think lots of our listeners will watch this and listen to this and agree. They will agree. You know what I mean? I think there's lots of organizations on our side who very much agree that there's a small number of people who need this medical transition because they have a pain like no other. And I would like, well, the pain of, as I said to him, the pain of not having children can be like no other in your late 30s. The pain of sexual dysfunction can be like no other. Not having a pair bond, not having a mate, not falling in love, they can be like no other. There's lots of different ways to have pain. There's something kind of been sold to people that the pain of gender distress is like no other. And I think I had it, so I've normalized it, because I don't underestimate how painful life can be. But at the same time, I don't buy that there's one special pain that is unlike any other of the many terrible, terrible ways to have pain, such as anorexia or depression. Mental pain is dreadful, and it's no less and no more gender dysphoria.
Right, that's the power of trans activism, though, and that is how you can see very clearly that he has been he has bought into all of their claims. And it was fascinating right at the beginning, right, when he says he wanted to take gender identity disorder out of DSM-IV because of pressure from trans activism. I've traced all the way back. I did that whole thing with DSM, and they were really like pressuring the APA to change. Well, they wanted gender identity disorder removed from DSM-V, and they ended up with gender dysphoria, which shifted it to the distress because you are supposedly trans. But I didn't realize that they were actually pressuring DSM-IV to get rid of gender identity disorder. So they were really, that's the DSM-IV was published in 1994. So they were, I assume, I mean, it takes years. I assume probably they, in the late 80s, maybe like very early 90s, is when trans activism first started pressuring the American Psychiatric Association to get the diagnosis removed. And that's fascinating to me because that was in the very, very early days. And he...
On that... Yeah, keep going, sorry.
Well, because they equate it with being gay. The big victory of gay rights was getting homosexuality removed from DSM-II in 1972 or 3. He sees it in that way. He sees it as the equivalent of being gay, and therefore you don't need a diagnosis. That's trans activism. It's not real. It's not true.
Yeah. No, I agree. I thought that was very interesting. I do know. I remember noting that the HBI-GDA, the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, that was named in the 70s, and it was gender dysphoria that they went for. Yeah. And I remember thinking to myself, they had that in their head for a long, long time. The fact that they called it the Gender Dysphoria Association in 1978, when surely nobody was talking about gender dysphoria. Dysphoria is a strange word. It's the opposite of euphoria. You don't hear it. And they had nailed that in 1978, arguably. And they also had gender dysphoria symposiums or symposia in the early 1970s. So they were well established wanting gender dysphoria, as far as I could see, for decades before they actually did it. But we're kind of going off on one here. To go back to Alan Francis and this interview, I hope listeners will benefit from it, because I hope they'll kind of, they'll have a feeling of familiarity when they realize how we kind of start kind of asking questions kind of quickly, and we start kind of go, but what do you think of this? And what do you think of that? And just the real nub of why you and I know each other, Mia, is in this interview. There's a really, really strong held belief that some people need this extraordinary, radical medical intervention that I have seen has caused thousands and thousands of people devastation, and people are determined that this is a good intervention. And I think there's a real sad lesson to be learned in a way in this interview.
the way that we ended up on the subject of gender was when I mentioned Paul McHugh. I compared him to Paul McHugh, and I brought up multiple personality disorder, and I suggested that this scandal. Oh no, I don't think I did at the beginning. I was just saying I asked him if he felt that this trans scandal or this trans epidemic was a psychiatry getting swept up in a cultural fad like multiple personality disorder. And my trouble is when he said he should have been on the front lines with Paul McHugh speaking out against multiple personality disorder, and he wasn't. And in my mind, I was thinking, you should be on the front lines now, speaking out, standing with us and speaking out. But as the conversation progressed, I realized that it does come down to the true trends. Multiple personality disorder was pure invention. He knew it, Paul McHugh knew it, everyone, all the critics knew it. There is, if you believe that some people are born trans, you can't take a strong stand on this. That's precisely it, isn't it? That's the divide.
And I'd love to lean in, if he was so good as to come back on again, I'd love to lean into what is that? What does that mean to be born trans? Let's just unpack that, because I presume the answer will be, an overflow of testosterone or estrogen. And, that has been tested. That doesn't stand up. That doesn't, pass muster.
One of the most fascinating parts to me that I wish we could have gone into was he was very careful, right, to not call it a diagnosis, to not call it a psychiatric disorder. He wanted it taken out of DSM-IV, so he doesn't see it as a psychiatric disorder. And then I can't remember if it was which one of us asked him, so what is it? Where you need a diagnostic code because you need lifelong medical intervention. I think it must have been
you
me.
ask him,
and where are we going to put it? And he responds with, well, we just put it's medical. Just create a medical condition. And I had this, that's what they did, right? That's literally what trans activists did with the World Health Organization. They had the World Health Organization create an entire new chapter just for trans, just for gender incongruence. This chapter didn't exist before. That's the power of trans activism. They get them to create an entire new chapter, and they move it from mental health to disorders of sexual health or something related to sexual health, and they just fabricate an entire new area of medicine. But to hear him say that, it's just so outright, just create a medical condition. And I thought, is there any other example of that outside of gender where we've just created a medical condition that doesn't even exist? There's no test for it, there's no sign of it in the body, there's no biological marker, there's no test, there's no objective measure, but we just create it because somebody wants to not be mentally ill. Surely not.
Well, as I often say, whenever trans activists say it's stigmatizing to be in the psychiatric section, I'm like, well, you're stigmatizing
mental
people
illness.
With psychiatric illness. Yeah, it's the most stigmatizing sentence you could say.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll let the listeners listen. I hope we've whetted your interest. But yeah, I think it's fascinating conversation. I really do.
I think it was too, and I don't know. I don't even know what to say. Yeah, it was fascinating, and I hope people enjoy it. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Beyond Gender. I am delighted to introduce our guest today, the very distinguished Professor Alan Francis. I will allow him to introduce himself, but he was, Professor Francis was involved in the DSM-III, DSM-IV, and was a critic of the DSM-V, and wrote a wonderful book, Saving Normal, and I'll read the subtitle: An Insider's Revolt Against Out-of-Control Psychiatric Diagnosis, DSM-V, Big Pharma, and the Medicalisation of Ordinary Life. Anyone who knows me well will know why I'm a big fan of his. Welcome, Dr. Francis.
My pleasure to be with you this morning.
Now, I have been a big fan for a long time, as I just said, but many of our viewers may not be aware of you. This might be the first time they're coming across you. So could you give us the Cliff Notes version of your long and distinguished career?
Briefly, I was part of the group that did DSM-III going back to the late 70s. And then I was in charge of DSM-IV, which was meant to be a very conservative document. And even though we had high standards for making any changes, we received 94 suggestions for new diagnoses. We included just 2. There were 3 epidemics, false epidemics of racing overdiagnosis of ADHD, of autism, and bipolar disorder. And so when DSM-V started with a mandate for change, encouraging new diagnoses, I became a critic of it. And so I guess if I wanted to summarize the work throughout my career, but especially in the last 15 years, it would be to try to caution people against careless overdiagnosis, because labeling, once labeled, a person may be haunted by that label for life, and it can lead to many harmful unintended consequences. So I think psychiatric diagnosis is essential when done well and accurately, but can become very harmful if it's done carelessly, and that most diagnosis these days is done carelessly. People are overdiagnosed, overmedicated, with consequences that often are very difficult to reverse.
Right, that brings me perfectly to probably my favorite quote of yours that I've seen you say many times is, psychiatric diagnoses should always be written in pencil, especially for teenagers and children. Could you go deeper into that? What do you mean by that?
I wish I had made that up. It was actually on a visit to Argentina that the people there were using that, and a person had actually written a paper on that topic. It's a brilliant notion. Right now, psychiatric diagnosis is often made by primary care doctors. They actually do 80% of the prescribing of psychiatric medication. Most of them have 10 or 15 minutes to see the patient. Often it's a pediatrician seeing a child. They have a time pressure to get the patient out of the office and to get paid for it. And so the first aspect, to get the patient out of the office, the easiest way to get a patient out of the office is to write a prescription. So they have a tendency to write prescriptions carelessly because it's a way of getting the patient satisfied with the visit. They need to get paid for it, and the way to get paid for it is to have a diagnosis. Psychiatric diagnoses require a great deal of time, not just in that one visit, but over time, especially with kids who are very unstable from visit to visit. But even for adults, the current pressures, people usually arrive at the worst moment in their life for their visit with a doctor. If you just wait, watchful waiting, many of the symptoms are going to improve within a month. People get much better within a month just waiting. But if you're the doctor in the office and you feel a pressure to make the patient feel understood and happy, you will give a prescription and you'll write a diagnosis for the insurance company. That diagnosis is not written in pencil, it's written in computer speak, and it will be on the patient's medical record for life. And that's why patients tend to accumulate numerous diagnoses over their lifetimes, many of those wrong, some of them internally inconsistent. And it's almost impossible to erase an inaccurate diagnosis. It's always easy to increase the severity of a diagnosis. It's impossible often to erase a misdiagnosis that's excessive. And so the failed crusade of my life has been to try to get doctors to be careful in their diagnosis and very cautious in their prescription habits, to constantly be thinking about wiping away diagnoses, not adding them, and to be de-prescribing medication rather than always adding new medication, to be worried about the fact that many symptoms that present are side effects of medication or withdrawal symptoms from medication, and to be getting a diagnosis should be like buying a house. It's a life-changing event that should never be done after a brief visit by someone who very often is untrained in psychiatry, may not be particularly interested. That's the primary care part of it. And psychiatrists have become way too comfortable with polypharmacy, with giving out many, many medications to the same patient, often with no empirical evidence that that's going to be useful, and not mindful of the fact that side effects add up. Often efficacy doesn't add up when you have several different drugs, but side effects do, and interactions between drugs do. So generally, it's a plea for caution that we've let the diagnostic genie out of the bottle, that we have ridiculously high rates of disorders being diagnosed and way too much medication.
And do you think people, I tend to think that, first of all, I know you've said it many times, that many of the symptoms of mental disorders are often just a response to life struggles. What we consider now symptoms of mental disorders are really just a normal response to the challenges of life. But do you think people get attached to their diagnosis as well? Like they start to see themselves through that lens and they shape their lives around it?
Well, about 5% of people in any population, and this number is pretty consistent around the world, 5% of people have a very severe, clear-cut mental disorder. And by and large, throughout the world, they're neglected. Where insufficient access to treatment. In America, we have an enormous homeless problem, enormous problem of psychiatric patients in prison. So there's a cruel paradox that the people who can be clearly diagnosed, clearly defined, and definitely, desperately need help tend to be those who least get it. In America, about 25% of people get a diagnosis in any given year, and 20% of people are on medication. So there's this tremendous gap between the 5% who definitely need it and people at the edges of the 25% who are dealing with the aches and pains and problems of everyday life, the situational stresses. I think that 20% of people in the U.S. get a psychotropic drug each year, 20%. Nearly the 5% of people who desperately need it often don't because there's no access to treatment. They wind up homeless on the street.
Wow.
It's clear to me that 20% of the population don't need a psychotropic drug, but probably more than 5% do. So somewhere between 5 and 20%, we have lots of people who are on medication for a situational problem. They went to the doctor. He started them on an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety drug. They got better within a month, and they think it's the medicine that made them better. But very often it was time. Watchful waiting, placebo effect would have had the same effect. But once you get better, you misattribute your success to the drug. And many people stay on medication for decades, lifetime, who don't need it. On the other hand, the psychiatric drugs all have withdrawal symptoms or can have withdrawal symptoms. They don't always do with every person, but they can. And if you try to stop the medication too abruptly, without supervision, and you get symptoms, you'll think, oh, the medicine prevented this, not realizing that it's withdrawal symptoms, not a relapse. It's not that stopping the medicines causing a recurrence of your original problem. It's that you have new withdrawal symptoms. So I think for many people, no one should listen to this and say, I'm going to stop my medicine. I didn't need it. That if a person has a severe psychiatric problem, they should definitely be on medicine, often for life. If a person started out with fairly mild or transient problems and they've been on medicine for a very long time, they should consider, under supervision, very gradually reducing the medicine. And I think that would be good for many people. I've known hundreds, maybe thousands of people who had symptoms that were related to drug side effect who got better with deprescribing. But the tendency is when there's a new symptom, always add a new medication, chasing the side effects of other medications rather than realizing that it may be a medication side effect. And I think in general, we need doctors to be much more cautious about diagnosing and treating new patients. And we need, with patients who are already diagnosed and treated, to have regular evaluations of whether the medicine is still useful for them, still necessary for them, and at least with a gradual deprescribing regimen may actually be an improvement to their lives rather than a detriment.
I often think about the term mild, that it gets kind of everybody can get mild everything, if you follow me. It particularly irks me as a diagnosis. And I come at it a little bit more cynically and less hopefully than yourself. And I agree with all of your work. I agree with what you're doing, but I feel it's ambitious because it feels like the ship has sailed. And I often wonder if we could lean into the word mild and give people more understanding of it. Because I saw you saying somewhere that you said, actually that's where all the money is being made, with the people who are kind of managing fine and who get a diagnosis on top of, their life, if you follow me. The really sick people, there isn't big money being made from them. It's kind of, I wouldn't call them the worried well, but they're not a million miles from the worried well. I wonder if we could move into the word mild and just say you don't need medication, you don't need a diagnosis. If you're mild, it's just part of the human condition. If we could lean into it and take it back off them, it might be a way to kind of regain territory in this situation.
It's very difficult because it's a continuum between the very clear-cut, severe mental illness that no one could confuse. It looks just like a disease, like any medical disease. It's so obviously debilitating, and the suffering cause is enormous, and the lack of ability to function. There's not a clear-cut boundary. It's a fuzzy boundary as we get towards, quotes, mild, and it's a very fuzzy boundary between mild psychiatric disorder and the problems of everyday life. And in terms of statistically, there are only that 5% of people who have the very severe mental disorders, and there are lots and lots of people who, almost everyone has the stress of everyday life. That's part of the human condition. And the 20% of people who are taking medication, that represents an enormous market for drug companies, 4 times bigger market than the people who actually need medications. So I think that, how do we define what's mild? When should a person feel that maybe what's happening to me is a normal reaction to a very tough situation rather than a mental disorder? I think that the one element of this is how long has it lasted. So anything that's of recent origin is less likely to be severe psychiatric disorder, more likely to be a reaction to current situation. How much stress is the person under? So if something has occurred recently and has occurred in reaction to a major stressor, then it's much more likely that that's a normal reaction, human reaction to difficulty, rather than something within the person that could better be conceived as a mental disorder. I think, as a rule of thumb, since there's no test, there's no biological test that to be able to sort this, time and observation is the best test. And a way of seeing this is that, to divide the sheep from the goats, watchful waiting helps you to determine how much of it is inside the person, how much of it is a reaction to an external stressor. So I really don't like the idea of making a diagnosis on a first visit. And especially with kids, for me, a diagnosis may take months or years before I'll have a sense of how much is a reaction to their development, part of immaturity, not mental disorder, how much of it's a reaction to trouble at home, how much of it's a reaction to school bullying or other problems that may have to do with peer pressure, how much of it is drug use in young teenagers. That you can't make this determination on a 15-minute visit. You often can't make this determination after months. So the insurance industry pushes towards a diagnosis, which in a way is short-sighted, because once a person gets a diagnosis, that often results in very expensive treatments that go on for very long. Yeah. It would be smarter, I think, not just better for patients, but smarter economically, if there were an allowance for more time for evaluation, more time for watchful waiting. It's better to have the person see the doctor for a number of visits without a diagnosis until things are clarified, rather than forcing a premature diagnosis that may not just be impairing to that individual and family, but also may actually cost more money, because once you get the diagnosis, you may be on a lifetime of medication. So how severe are the symptoms? How impairing are they? How enduring are they? How recently did they begin? Under what stressful situations did they happen? Well, there's a tendency now to call stress-related disorders and grief, disorders related to anxiety-provoking situations or to the loss of loved ones or loss of financial stability. Grief and situational stress are being redefined as psychiatric disorders. The primary care physician usually being the conduit for that. And once the diagnosis is made, it lives forever. It doesn't disappear. It's not written in pencil. It's written in computer code that will last throughout the patient's life. And I think patients have to be cautious. I think that given a world in which medication is dispensed so carelessly, patients should be very cautious when given a prescription about whether it makes sense for them. I think it's important to be informed. I think another point you made that's very interesting is there's been a tendency, especially with social networks, to create groupings of people who strongly identify with the disorder and with one another. Now, this can be very useful or it can be very harmful. It's very useful in the sense that it helps people who previously felt uniquely damned and impossible to be understood. It helps give them a social network. The computer, especially AI, can now be much more informative than any MD will be about almost everything. So the computer AI is all-knowing. It makes mistakes, and it can create great damage with its misinformation. But you can get a tremendous amount of information about your condition by asking simple questions and prompts. The upside of this is that informed consumers will not be rushed into a diagnosis or rushed into medication in the same way as someone who has absolute respect for the medical establishment. You should be skeptical of overdiagnosis and be careful not to begin taking medication unless it really does make sense. To get second opinions with other physicians, second opinions with your family, second opinions with your own research. The downside is that social networking can create communities of people who become career patients, even though the label doesn't really apply to them. I think this has been particularly noxious with eating disorders and with autism and with ADHD. That the spreading of the tremendous increase in rates to some degree have to do with computer algorithms and with the support that's provided by the network. Eating disorders is a particularly noxious example. That the computer algorithms, the minute a person prompts at all for anything to do with healthy eating, will start bombarding them with aspects of healthy eating that pretty soon degenerate into encouragement for anorexia. And once you get into that rabbit hole and get more and more support for the idea that you have an eating disorder, it becomes a vicious cycle. And I've seen many people who've been caught in that vicious cycle. Autism, when we added the diagnosis of Asperger's in DSM-IV, we did it because child psychiatrists said that for every person who had classic autism, which was always showing itself before the age of 3 with very severe symptoms and a very great inability to ever have a normal life. The classic autism was so clearly defined that the rate was just 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 5,000. Get that. The average rate of autism is 1 in many thousands before we added something called Asperger's. The choice of the name Asperger's was unfortunate because he was a Nazi, but we'll leave that aside.
I know.
We did a careful field trial, and that field trial showed that if we added Asperger's as it was defined in DSM-IV, as it would be defined in DSM-IV, if we included it, the rate of autism would increase by 3 times. And that seemed reasonable. The people were suffering, but didn't have that onset before age 3 with a debilitating condition that made their lives absolutely impossible for them, difficult for their families. It turned out that before 2 years were up, the rate had dropped from about 1 in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5,000 to 1 in 100. And before 2 years were up, or 3 years were up, it dropped to 1 in 38. So there was this tremendous 40 or 50-fold increase in the rate of autism. Partly this was generated by school services, so that many districts had special programs that were only geared to kids who had the definition of autism. And one of the things you learn in DSM is that anything that can be misused in the system will be misused. So it was well-meaning parents, well-meaning school districts began the misdiagnosis of many kids as autistic because that would get them out of a chaotic class of 40 kids into a very small class of maybe 5 kids. And it may have been good for the kids, except for getting the diagnosis, that the diagnosis itself had stigma. But then the next evolution was fascinating. It was social network and with techies and people becoming attached to almost a status symbol associated with being on the spectrum. It's almost like if you're on the spectrum, you're going to be especially gifted in the technological world. That it became a kind of social fad outside the medical world of people self-identifying as being autistic. And again, there's something good about that because it gives you a community of fellow sufferers who can be very supportive in a way that maybe other people can't. It gives you information. It gives you support. It gives you a sense of identity that previous, social awkwardness and other problems get encompassed by this label. It reduces kind of the stigma that may have been attached to how you felt yourself, but it also raises a new stigma. And the diagnosis is very unstable. That in studies that looked at it, the reliability of autistic spectrum is low, and the stability is also low. That someone who gets the diagnosis at the age of 15 may not have the diagnosis at the age of 17. But something that's supposed to be a lifelong trait condition is being diagnosed for state problems, the difficulties of the moment. So again, I think the tendency to throw around labels carelessly leads to fad diagnosis with often well-meaning intentions, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions and terrible unintended consequences.
Which brings us very nicely to the issue that Stella and I have been speaking about for years, and many of our viewers will be very familiar with. Really, truly, everything you have just said, in my mind, I'm thinking gender dysphoria, trends, the whole thing, the online communities, you're talking about eating disorders and anorexia. We've got that with trends. We've got these kids are falling into these online communities and they come to the conclusion that their pubertal woes or their mental health challenges are a sign that they are transgender, and then they end up that it's not even that they're receiving a diagnosis, they're self-diagnosing, and then they show up and they just receive the diagnosis as a secondary. It's not even, it's entirely based on self-diagnosis. But then as well, like the just the massive increase, you saw the increase in autism with Asperger's, but we have seen about a 5,000% increase in teenage girls coming out as transgender in 1 decade. We've seen the explosion, and I like to think of you as a bit of a contrarian in the world of psychiatry. I don't know if that's an appropriate label, but Dr. Paul McHugh is another contrarian who has in the mid-90s, when his multiple personality disorder was coming to a close, he wrote a great piece, and he said about once a decade, psychiatry just gets swept up in something fundamentally incoherent, unleashes something really harmful, and then spends about a decade digging itself out of the mess that it made. And it's, and he attributes it to oversimplification or misdirected emphasis or pure invention with MPD. Like, do you see what I see? Do you see the gender dysphoria, the whole trans phenomenon, as being another such fundamentally incoherent practice that has arisen because psychiatry got swept up in a cultural fad?
It's complicated. Paul's a hero of mine and a friend, and I always felt guilty that I didn't fight harder against multiple personality disorder in the 90s. I helped to control the enthusiasm about multiple personality in DSM-IV, so the second presents the contrarian view. But I should have been out in the front lines, and I wasn't. I think I felt that my role would be compromised if I were too public a figure. And what he did was heroic and absolutely right on. I think we both agree in part about the gender issues, but I think he's more extreme than I am. So to try to clarify it, first off, I wanted to remove gender identity disorder completely from DSM-IV.
You did?
Yeah. I thought it was equivalent to homosexuality. Why should it be in the manual? And we spoke to the trans groups and trans representatives at the time, and the reason we kept it in was that there wasn't agreement about what was best in the community. A good reason that there were those people who felt it should be removed because it would remove stigma, to take it out of the manual, in the same way that removing homosexuality had helped reduce the stigma of gay behavior in 1972 when it was removed from the DSM-II. And I felt that was very important. However, there were people in the community who were very worried about the practical consequences, that having the diagnosis in the manual led to services. That without it being in the manual, people who might otherwise get services would not be able to get services. And we kept it in mostly because of that part of the trans community that was worried about the practical economic implications of removing it. In terms of what's happened since this enormous increase in rates, I'm not sure 5,000 seems like an exaggeration to me. But
it's no exaggeration. It's true.
Well, we could debate that, but I think it certainly has spread. The rates have gone up dramatically. And the question arises, how much of this increase in rates is the greater acceptance in the world that allows people who would have led desperate lives hiding their gender feelings now being able to express them? How much of this is a contagion effect along the same lines as multiple personality, autism, and eating disorders? And obviously it's going to be some element of both. So certain people who previously would have been closeted now have the freedom to speak, and that's valuable for them. Other people who may be influenced by the social networking that's been attached to this may confuse identity problems of adolescence with gender confusion that's temporary, not permanent. And there's the concern that it may be a very useful diagnosis is the wrong word. It may be a useful label for useful condition, a useful source of needed treatment for some people. It may be something that's a temporary feeling in others that shouldn't be acted upon with dramatic interventions, certainly not surgical and maybe not medical. And how do you determine the rates? I mean, the polling in this area is not very accurate. I don't believe that you can trust any poll that says the rate of transgender is 0.5% or 5%. I don't think that you can trust any poll that is very definitive about what the rate is in any given age group, partly because it depends so much on how the questions are asked, and partly because the group of people being polled will be so heterogeneous. So some people have a very early onset of a sense that they're in the wrong body. And it starts when they're the first toys they play with, the first experiences they have. It becomes very clear very early. It's prevailing in all the things they do, and it's part of their early growing up. That's very different. And they're wanting to have a surgical or medical correction of what they perceive to be a cruel fate dealt them by their biology. That feels like something that comes from within them and that is an essential part of who they are, and it's very clear-cut. It's like the severe for psychiatric, and certain things are severe when they have early onset and it's pervasive in everything in the person and they're enduring. There are other people who may be confused about life, and at the age of 13, 14, 15, start thinking about, well, I'm confused about this part of my life, I'm confused about that part of my life, I'm confused also about my gender. And where the forces of social networking and the algorithms can get them started to identify temporarily with gender confusions that may not be permanent. And for some of these people, it may be a very brief experience. For some, it may be longer lasting. And it's that same kind of continuum where there is not a clear cut. And part of why this is such a terribly difficult medical problem is that the treatments often call for clear cut yes or no decisions at very particular points in time. It makes a big difference whether you delay puberty or you don't delay puberty. So the decision is a yes or no, but the people presenting to you present with a continuum of problems that make it very hard to say this is the criteria set that will have us go forward versus maybe we should be more cautious and do more watchful waiting. So Paul is more decisively than I am clear about what a disaster this has been for so many people, and I believe it has been for some. But I think that we have to recognize that for a substantial number of the people who say that they have a kind of mistake in nature that needs to be corrected, for many of them, it's true. And one of the things to me that's interesting in trying to understand this problem, which I don't understand and feel confused about, is the fact that there have been so few malpractice cases. There have been so few people saying, I made the change and it was an absolute disaster. The fact that
I think I should stop you there because actually there's been a huge rise in malpractice cases, an absolutely astronomical rise, and there's a lot of ongoing lawsuits right now. So of exactly that. And do you want to go ahead?
And the statute of limitations.
Yes.
You see, because you've got typically 2 years, and first of all, there's a honeymoon period after you go through these medical treatments where you really feel like this solved your problems and you've finally found your authentic self. And then the doubt starts. It typically takes 5 to 8 years, I think, for detransition and regret to set in. And by then the statute of limitations has expired. And so I think you can't measure it on lack of malpractice lawsuits. And as well, there's something unique about trans in that anyone who speaks out saying that they have detransitioned or they regret, they will get attacked by very aggressive trans activists. So there's a motivation to stay silent as well. But I just want to go back to when I took it's actually, I can give you the number, 5,337% increase in teenage girls being referred to the Tavistock Gender Clinic, the centralized gender clinic in London in the UK. And so what do you make of it that historically...
Let's be clear, that's not really a statement about what population rates would be. That's a very selected...
No, but here, it's very important. Is it not important that historically it would have been typically childhood onset young boys presenting to these gender clinics or middle-aged men, and teenage girls were never seen in these gender clinics. They were vanishingly rare and there were no cases. And then all of a sudden an explosion.
I'm all disagreeing with the idea that there's been an explosion of social network generated increase in rates. But the 5,000 percentage thing, I think I'd be cautious about. I'm very cautious about the polling rates in the general population. I think that they're a real problem for the reasons I said before. But the idea of how many referrals to a given clinic that's a very specialized, specific number to that clinic. It doesn't really describe what's happening in the general population.
It's replicated all over the world in every pediatric gender clinic. They saw around 2014, 2015, as the modern trans rights movement got going, you see the inflection point on the graph. You're off. Like a whoosh.
If you have a very low base rate to start with, of course you're going to have a user. I'm not arguing the overall call. I am arguing the use of that number because that number's questionable.
Yeah. Could I come in with a couple of points? I suppose I had what would now be called childhood onset gender dysphoria, and I had it for many, many years. And it was consistent, insistent, and persistent. And I did have the freedom of puberty, and ultimately puberty was the very thing that in the long sense, brought me round. And I know there's always been, like 80% of children who have childhood onset gender dysphoria do grow out of it in puberty. But since then, I've worked in this field for some years, and we run a service for people who either are lost in transition or regret their transition or have detransitioned. And their stories are remarkably similar to mine. I don't see a difference. When you said, I was surprised when you said it, you said, and they would live something like lives of desperation. And I thought, but how do we actually know that? Because the comorbidities among this population is very high. They have very, very often other issues. And so how can we actually disentangle, is this sense of gender so devastating for them? Or could it be that life is devastating for them because they have many challenges? The likelihood of them having autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, eating disorders are really elevated. And so I'm kind of surprised that for all other conditions, you're very kind of on the ball about what could be going on with the diagnosis, but you presume a diagnosis of gender dysphoria leads to a condition which is some sort of transgender identity. And I wonder about that. I kind of think it's a leap. And is it the only condition in the DSM that offers surgery for a treatment option? Is there any other treatment in the DSM that would suggest surgery is the appropriate response?
Require a difference. I think I am very confused about this area, and I think I'm confused not because I'm dumb about it or because I haven't looked at it. I think I'm confused because it's confusing, and I think it's confusing because there's not a right answer. And that if there were a clear-cut set of criteria or a biological test that separated those people for whom this is a inbuilt, I believe that there are people who have an early, profound sense of being cheated by biology. I believe there are people for whom the treatments are useful. And I believe that for those people, being too strongly against any kind of gender correction is harmful and feeds into a right-wing kind of lack of tolerance that can be politically manipulated. So I think that there is a real problem, like I felt it's a real problem with severe psychiatric disorders. I think there's an equivalent real problem that deserves addressing, and it shouldn't be a political football, which it certainly has become in the United States.
I certainly agree on that. It should not be political.
But it is.
It is, but is it political because psychiatry and the medical world have failed to regulate themselves?
No, it's political because it was a very convenient way of distracting voters from other real issues onto something that is not an important policy problem for the United States, but making that the central reason why many people would vote for a very right-wing agenda, not just in this area, but in other areas. So I don't think you can avoid the fact it's a political issue. I think when you're doing your podcast, you have to be aware of the fact that this can be abused in a political sense to the larger detriment of the country, to having the government we have, but also used in a political sense to deprive people who really do deserve and need treatment, who may not get it because states are making that treatment illegal. And I think it's a mistake for the states to be making this illegal decision and a political decision rather than a medical one. That doesn't absolve the medical establishment, but this is not something that was created by doctors, nor could it be self-monitored by doctors. This is something that's a larger issue, and I think one in which there is not a clear right answer. So just as if we're going to use the analogy to psychiatric problems, I'm not saying this is a psychiatric problem, but suppose we're using the analogy. My position is we should be focusing our attention on the smaller group of people who have a very early onset, a very complete, pervasive feeling, very clear markers from early on that they do need attention. They do need to be validated. And then at the other end, we have to be very cautious when the onset is late and mediated by what may be peer pressure, maybe social networking algorithms, maybe wanting a support group, not being clear who they are, and this becomes a way of getting a support group. So I applaud what you're doing, except if it becomes misused in a political sense, and except if you're assuming it applies to every single person, because I think there are people who really do need the treatment.
On the child diagnosis, though,
sort of where Paul and I would disagree. I think Paul would be more extreme in seeing that a totally horrible thing happening, as I do believe multiple personality was. I don't think this is equivalent to multiple personality. I think it has some of the same features in the overreach, but this has a real core, whereas multiple personality, I don't think had a real core.
Yeah, I mean, I do think multiple personality was pure invention. This is more an oversimplification situation, but I guess I'm with Paul McHugh, because I think this is worse than multiple personality disorder. And I think when it's over and we can really see the victims and we can really see the damage done, I think we will find that this one was worse. Because you talk about psychiatric, I love your psychiatric diagnoses should always be written in pencil, but we're writing this diagnosis in blood, like we're actually carving it into the bodies of teenagers. We're having girls are having mastectomies when they're 16.
Yeah.
Does that make you feel?
I wish there were a simple answer to this, but particularly because the decisions that are made when a girl enters puberty will last, or a boy for that matter, enters puberty, are decisions that have a lasting impact one way or the other. And I guess all I'm saying is that in being mindful of the damage that's done to people who get excessive treatment, you also have to be mindful to the damage that's done to people who will not have access to treatment, who really need it. And so I think it's not like there's a clear right answer here for everyone. It's a very individual problem without clear medical guidelines, without clear guidelines for parents. And I often can't give advice because I don't know what's right.
Could I just point out about the treatment? The treatment is, I often think, a sledgehammer to crack a nut, that there's a lot of ways to treat distress in life. And gender dysphoria is distress. I know, that's what it is. It's a sense of distress. Now, to go towards body modifications, changing your body, you know what I mean? And phalloplasties, mastectomies, vaginoplasties, facial feminization, hormones, infertility, sexual impairment. These are really, really heavy interventions. As I said, I don't know of anything else in the DSM that actually suggests that surgery is the appropriate response. Am I wrong?
Take away DSM. This whole thing shouldn't be in the DSM. Okay. It's not a DSM issue.
Okay.
It's a society.
Oh, where should it be then? Because you need a billing code basically in order to get all of your hormones and your surgeries and your care. And so I know activists, that's why we got gender dysphoria, because they wanted to shift the diagnosis from the identity to the discomfort that you feel because you have a mismatch in your body. But where would it be if you need lifelong medical intervention? So therefore you need a billing code. Where are we going to put this if it's not psychiatric?
Medical.
But what's the condition?
You would have a condition that would be a medical condition that requires treatment. It's not hard to do that. Developing codes and labels is easy, and it would be very easy to have it somewhere in the OBGYN code system, for instance.
You don't think the problem actually resides in the mind, though?
No, I don't think this is particularly a psychiatric issue.
I saw you earlier on, you equated it quite similar. You seem to see it as being similar to being gay. Well, I would consider it very different to being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. I think that, there's no medical interventions required for being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Also, it's empirical. And you know what I mean? Like, it's gender dysphoria, or this sense that we're talking about, it's subjective. It's completely reliant on self-reporting.
Yeah,
and
that's a different orthogonal issue to me. It's not. to me, the issue of gender is not something that's inherently a psychiatric issue. I think that it has more to do with aspects of, and you're right that there is not, actually there isn't a clear boundary with gays either. It's not as if in polls you can have a number that says X number of people, that all of this is subjective. But I would not want to make this seem like the people who feel that they are gender misidentified, that they have a psychiatric problem. I don't think that, just as I wouldn't want gay people to feel, oh, I suffer from a psychiatric problem, I don't want people who feel that from the age of 3, they were a boy playing with dolls, feeling that it was a mistake. There are people like that. And I think that in your position, where we disagree, is not, we completely agree that it's overdone. Where I'm disagreeing with you, and I think disagreeing with you fairly strongly and disagreeing with Paul, is you seem to feel that it's always a mistake to do any treatment, that anyone who feels this way, even if there's a very early onset and it's every aspect of their life from early on, that they should never get treatment, that they should never experience what you see as mutilating, medical and surgical treatment.
I would.
That's where we may disagree.
I wouldn't use the word mutilate, but I'd like to just go into these young children who present with childhood onset gender dysphoria. We know from all the old literature before the field was captured by activism that most of these young boys, they were mostly boys, and if left to develop unimpeded, they would grow up to be homosexual adults, because extreme gender nonconformity in childhood is a strong indicator of homosexuality in adulthood.
Exactly.
And so
right.
I think it's always wrong to transition a child, because most of the time you're transitioning and medicalizing a future homosexual. Would you agree with that?
We agree with that. And we agree that at the age of 12 or 13, when a decision may have to be made whether to delay puberty or not, that it's a heartbreaking decision without a right answer. I hope we could agree that it's a heartbreaking decision, often without a right answer, and it has to be very individualized by person and family, because I think that having an activist view on your side can create problems in one direction that has to be balanced against having an activist view on the other side. And I think what we're agreeing is I'm much more confused about this than you are.
I'm sorry. I think it's always wrong to put that little boy on puberty blockers when he reaches puberty, because he can only settle into his sexual identity if he goes through puberty and experiences his sexual identity. He can't become a healthy homosexual unless he develops his sexual identity. So if you block his puberty, you block the chance to do that.
And you're very right with maybe the majority of kids, but not all.
But there's no way to identify.
Maybe very wrong on the other side to have that kid grow to be 6'4" and weigh 240. So that it's really.
Why is that very wrong?
Well, it makes it life a lot harder to be 6'4" and weigh 240. So again, you're very.
Just there's 2 points I want to make on that. It's also very hard never to have gone through puberty and therefore lose the chance of being a parent. You take choices. I'm not saying one is right or one wrong, but I'm saying choices have to be made when you have a difficult condition. And 98% of children who go on puberty blockers go on cross-sex hormones. So it's arguably the beginning of a medical transition from around the age of 12.
So not be activist on either side and see it as complicated, in some ways tragic problem without a clear answer. And the individual factors are going to be hugely important. Individual preferences are going to be hugely important, and that there's just not a right answer here. I don't
Fair
think.
enough, but I don't want to push it. Can I ask you one question? Let's push back, because I know you have to go.
This conversation went in a direction I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
Yes. Go, Stella.
I've only got one question, which is, why do you see being gay as almost the same as being trans? Why do you see that? What are the similarities?
I'm not seeing it on every single dimension. I'm seeing it on whether I think it should be in the manual. So that, of course, there are obvious
Okay.
differences on a million different dimensions, but I just don't think either should be in the psychiatric manual. I think having an added stigma of a psychiatric diagnosis is not helpful. And if people have distress related to their sexual choices or their sexual identity, that distress can be diagnosed without bringing in the sexual identity. Just that anxiety, depression happen in people. They happen in people who may be gay in their sexual choices or maybe have gender differences. So I'm not saying on every dimension they're the same. I'm only saying in terms of the psychiatric system, I don't think they belong as a psychiatric disorder.
Okay. And so let's go back. Can we end with going back to the DSM? Because I really want to. You were there for DSM-III, DSM-IV, DSM-V. First of all, is DSM-6 in the works? And if it is, what are your hopes for it? What do you think will happen?
I have no hopes for it, only fears. I think it's become it's a publishing franchise. So there's a strong incentive to have changes. Otherwise, why would you be republishing? And so, experts always like changes. Experts are very blind to unintended consequences. They're very in love with their pet diagnoses. They'll always want to tweak whatever's there, add a new diagnosis. So probably, I think we would have been better off staying with DSM-III. Probably any change in the diagnostic system causes more harm than good because of unintended consequences, even if the people are well-meaning, which most of them are, even if when people are well-meaning, every change is likely to cause more harm than good.
Okay. I thought that you said it's a $3 trillion industry. Well, extraordinary.
I don't know if that's true, but it's a big industry.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Thank you for giving your time.
It was very lively.
No bother.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Bye-bye.
Good for the brain. I know. Take care.